Welcome to the Retiring Real Estate Investor Podcast, where we will discuss how to defer taxes on the sale of your property, earning passive real estate income, and everything you need to know to go from active investor to passive investor. Join us as we interview passive investment sponsors, explore the journey of other retiring real estate investors, and share our due diligence process we perform to select passive investments. Investment advisory services provided by Insight Investment Advisors, LLC, a registered investment advisor. This podcast is only intended for clients and interested investors residing in the states in which we are registered to provide investment advisory services or exempt from registration. Please contact us to determine if the firm provides investment advisory services in the state where you reside. All content on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. Material presented is believed to be reliable sources, and no representations are made by our firm as to another party's informational accuracy or completeness. Insight Investment Advisors, LLC and its representatives do not provide tax or legal advice, and nothing herein should be construed as such. Always consult with your tax advisor or attorney regarding your specific circumstances. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Retiring Real Estate Investor Podcast. We're being hijacked today, because we're going to talk about auctions and land and brokerage and farmland. So a small deviation for us, but it's going to be really interesting. I'm joined by two folks today. Shawn Terrell, awesome to have you on board as our guest. And I have a new co-host, Julia Fritzlin, who is one of our advisors at Insight and really specializes in the land and farmland, is going to be along for the ride with us today. Julia, Shawn, how are you guys doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. I was pausing, Julia, because it's ladies first, right? So, no, I'm doing great. I appreciate you having me on the show with you and Julia today.
Awesome. So let's get started. Shawn, talk to us a little bit about your background. United Country of Auction Services, the president of United Country of Auction Services. Give our listeners a little bit of your background, where you're coming from. And tell them a little bit about your role.
Yeah, first off, thank you for the invite to this. We enjoy podcast shows. I think it's a great way to get the message out. And having been a big fan of those, we started one also. President of United Countries Auction Services, it gave us a great communication strategy in here to do that. So a little bit about me. I'm from Northwest Oklahoma. Grew up custom harvesting, if any of the listeners know what that is. But we cut crops. We were it's like a carnival with heavy machinery, if you can imagine that, just cutting wheat and corn. And I got into the auction business at a fairly young age, and I stayed with that. It was a good fit for me. Fast forward in 2007, I got recognized by one of the more mature non-urban real estate franchise companies in the United States, which is United Country. They were wanting to roll out an auction services platform in their company, which turns 100 years old this year. And they hired me at that time to be the vice president. Later was promoted to president of auction services within the company. And I've been here for 17 years, just helping auctioneers grow their business and training real estate brokers how to adopt and inject auction services into their company.
That's awesome. I have a stereotypical connotation of what I think an auction looks like and feels like. I like it because I think it's really fun, but enhance my stereotype or beat it back a little bit. Why do people sort of use auctions still? And can I think of the live auction as what I'm expecting, someone talking really fast and things are flying around, there's a lot of action? Is it still like that, or is it a little bit more calm?
As we get into that, I think the first thing, out of fairness, is here's a history lesson.
Yes,
the first recorded auctions on the planet were in about 500 AD, and they were selling wives at auction. Selling wives on the auction block.
Oh no!
So there we can start racing some today, right? But the reality is, auctions are not a new technique. They've been around for many, many years. Fast forward to when the country was founded. People were settling on the East Coast, Plymouth Rock, right? Whenever they first came to settle here. And then as they moved westward, they had accumulated a lot of items that were not going to make the journey with them across the West. And they were selling those under the auction banner on the East Coast. Those auctioneers and just progress in general followed across the western part of the United States. And here we are today, still selling goods and real estate and general merchandise, or as we call it, chattel property, estate items, selling those at auction. So it's a timeless tradition. It's been around for a long time.
What's sort of some of those differences between is there a difference between farmland auctions and residential auctions? How does that look and feel?
Yeah, there's a great significance. And I think the best way to describe that is put yourself into a farmer's shoes, the American farmer today. If you're familiar or unfamiliar with them, let's familiarize. So everything that they do, buying used equipment or selling equipment, a lot of times goes through the auction method of marketing. They raise cattle, and those cattle, when they become market weight or mature enough to be sold, are sold at a local livestock auction. They raise corn and wheat and soybeans and things. Those are sold on the U.S. Board of Trade, which again is an auction. So auctions are woven into the fabric, into the farming and ranching communities across the United States. They're a mainstay. And that means that we're working with generation old farmers that were trained from their grandparents and great grandparents and they're, on down. It's okay to buy things and sell things at a public auction. So fast forward, here we are in today's arena. Farmland is still very, very strong at auction. Rural land, recreational property, ranch property, raising horses or cattle, that kind of property is very prevalent at auction. Residential, not as much, not nearly as much. Mm-hmm. And I have to contribute that to the fact that we're not seeing the parents and grandparents and great-grandparents indoctrinating and training their kids it's okay to sell your home or your commercial property at an auction. Mm-hmm. They have maybe seen under different times in America where the markets fluctuate. There's liquidation strategies that have taken place to get rid of a large block of properties and homes or properties. Sometimes it gets oversaturated in the market, and the market price is not as attractive as what you'd like to see then. So I think that diminishes the value of the process quite a bit.
Can you think of any markets out there that do lean towards residential auctions? If I'm going to buy a home, I'm in Kansas City, and that's not typical of this market. Is there anywhere out there that's doing auction style for just single family homes?
That's a great question, Julia. There's some hot spots across the United States where there have been some age-old auction companies that have trained those consumers in small markets where they can get their arms around them and educate them. I come from a town of about 700 people in Northwest Oklahoma. It's a real small community. And in that region of Oklahoma, it is not uncommon at all to see when somebody passes away, their estate home, they're selling all of the contents, and at noon, they're going to sell the home, the residence. People are very accustomed to buying homes in those settings. But once again, you're dealing with larger demographics. You're dealing with a lot of turnover in, let's say, Kansas City. And what happens in this market is the majority of that property is listed and sold traditionally, and you're training consumers that that's how it's done. So we have had very, very successful sales at auctions in Kansas City. But the frequency is not there yet to really educate the consumer the way that we want to.
What's some of the advantages or disadvantages of going the auction route or going down a more traditional, say, brokerage selling sort of private route? And maybe differentiate that between, maybe focus there on more farmland or land in that sort of response. Like, what's the advantage of being in auction?
That's a great question, because there's a lot of misinformation about auctions, that every time you have an auction, the property has to be sold regardless of the price. Well, that's a specific type of auction. That's an absolute auction or an unreserved auction. Most of the auctions that transact are with a seller's reserve or with the right to accept or reject the high bid. Another one is you don't have a chance to inspect or to look at the property whenever it's being sold at auction. Again, that's inconsistent. That you have property preview dates. Most auction companies, if not all of them, would welcome pre-auction inspections. They want you to come see that and be very comfortable with what you're purchasing, because they want that transaction to be finite. You know, on auction day, you're making a purchase and you're buying it as is. So our goal as auctioneers is to educate you and to make sure that you've got all of the information prior to doing that. Also, financing. Financing can be a little bit of a tactical burden for some people because they are reliant upon the appraisal and they're reliant upon, you know, their financing to be approved and for it to come through. In an auction, it's considered a cash sale in most of those contracts, which means if you go to an auction today and you raise your hand and you're bidding and you pay $200,000 for a property at auction, the seller and the auctioneer don't necessarily care where that $200,000 comes from. The contract's not contingent on your ability to get financing, but you are welcome to go get financing on the property. The risk in that is generally at an auction, you're making a down payment instead of an earnest money deposit. There's a nuance in that because they expect you to put maybe 5% or 10% down, non-refundable, and the balance due in 30 days. And you'll see that in a lot of auction terms and conditions. So I think there's some of the things, Brandon, that make it a little bit more challenging for people, for buyers, is just unfamiliarization of auctions. And I'm just not comfortable with it because I've never bought property at auction. I'm more comfortable with a contract that allows me to write the contingencies in it and to set the stage for, if everything falls into place, then I'm a buyer on this property. But if something doesn't, I want to renegotiate the contract. Most of the time, that's not going to be an option at an auction.
Gotcha.
Could you get potentially a better price knowing that you as the buyer are assuming some sort of risk that may or may not be applicable in a different sale setting?
Again, the questions are right on point. So this is what I would say to that, Julia, is rarely will you see people come in and start offering money on top of what a publicly listed value is of a property. Gotcha. That $200,000 home is listed in an MLS or on a website for sale. Most people don't come in and say, I'll give 205, now 210, now 215. They're going to start working the other direction. So the potential for that property to bring more money is at auction. That is, we start at the bottom and work our way up instead of at the top and have to whittle our way down. With that being said, I think common sense would tell you there's an old NAR statistic, the National Association of Realtors, which NAR would tell you that in the high 90s, 95, 96% or more of the real estate in this country is not sold at auction. It's listed and sold traditionally. That is because the vast majority of buyers are going to be sensitive to the requirements to participate in that sale. They're going to need financing. They're going to want to have a professional home inspection, and we're talking about residential. And if the home inspectors find some things, we want to renegotiate on that. That the appraisal, it didn't appraise for 200. It only appraised for 180,000. Now I want to negotiate the purchase price in the contract. The thing to remember about the American public is there is a tremendous amount of cash. And I know I'm speaking to two people that deal in Delaware statutory trust, right? And DSTs. There's a tremendous amount of cash out there in the marketplace. What we find in farmland, if we move from residential back to farmland, is in about the first 5 to 10 minutes of the auction, the actual value, the perceived value of what a farm is goes out the window. It becomes more about not having this opportunity after 40 years, this farm is finally available on the market. this is my one chance to buy it. If I have the capital, I'm going to be a participant. Now the price may get ridiculous, at some point. And I say that's more than 20% above market. I'm out. But yes, the upside is always there for those farms. And interesting nuances. I see a lot of farms that are sometimes overpriced traditionally on the marketplace. They do not get sold. And then they're taken to auction, and in some cases can bring even more money than they were listed for. And that goes back into the psychology that's in that room. Human beings, Americans in particular, don't like to lose. When we're in a heated debate over property and values, we don't like to lose. So yeah,
it's fascinating. Flip to the seller side. Who makes a good seller at auction? This sounds advantageous for the seller.
It can be very advantageous for a seller, but again, sellers, they tend to focus on what is the current retail value of my property. We'll talk about residential. My wife and I own a home in Mesa, Arizona, that we just put under contract last week. And the question may be, why did you not sell that home at auction? Well, there's a few factors. And I'm a professional auctioneer by trade. I love the auction method of marketing, but I would tell you in this instance, I was not a good candidate for an auction seller. One, because we don't need the money and we're very patient in the market. We're not in a hurry to sell our property. Number two is I'm looking at the top end of the retail price in that market, and I'm not really willing to waver that much for what we would consider a cash sale. What is the cash value of that property today? If you sold that at auction, have an inspection on the property is great, not subject to your ability to get financing, not subject to appraisal, not subject to any renegotiation. I think common sense would be that most people under those terms, the way they're going to mitigate risk is in the amount of money they pay for it. So when do we see people that are good sellers? How could I become a good client, a good potential seller for an auction? And those people tend to yield, we'll deal with first a troubled asset or an asset that they're not sure exactly where to value the asset, either from a condition standpoint or it's been overbuilt. I looked at a home one time in Hilton Head, and a guy had built in the middle of $1 and $2 million homes. He built like a $12 million home right in the middle of them. And then things happen, life changes over time, and he wanted to sell the property, and he left that on the market for 2 or 3 years trying to sell that. Of course, he wants to extract the majority of his money that he put into that, but he made kind of a fatal mistake in building. He grossly overbuilt for the area. And when nothing else worked and they couldn't figure out exactly what the price point it should be listed is, then they call the auction company and say, listen, we need to find fair market value on this property. So those are, a couple of scenarios where sellers can be good auction sellers. I'm also a firm believer, if you have a reasonable conservative value, and let's say there's an old rule of thumb for auctioneers where reserve pricing should be set somewhere in the neighborhood of around 70%. It's a 70% rule. So if you have a $100,000 home in the open market, we get this up to $70,000 plus or minus in a cash sale. You should be ready to sell that home. $200,000, $140,000, $50,000, you should be ready to sell that home. And when you're dealing with somebody that says we're motivated, we don't know exactly where fair market value is today, but we're more focused on the goal of not owning the asset than we are on milking every dollar out of it. It's not as much about the price. Those can be great auction sellers.
Got you. It seems like the converse might be true on, say, the farm or land side, where you have something that you've held for a long time, it has tremendous value and that people have a desire for it. It seems like auction would be the better place for you to be and let people bid on it. Let those natural human instincts kick into gear in that auction as opposed to selling it private. Am I thinking about that the right way?
You're thinking about it exactly right. Brandon, here is a perfect case study of that. We are right now on our website at bidheritage.com. We are selling a 160-acre crop farm in Barton County, Missouri. This farm has been in the Bateman family since the 1860s. It's never been outside of their family. Yeah, that's a long time.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think their great, maybe great grandfather homesteaded that farm in Missouri, and then it's had a Bateman on it all these years. We're at the end of the line. So the father passed away in his trust. He had 2 daughters, neither one of them farm. The home has not been taken care of. The home's in pretty poor shape on the corner of the farm, but the value in this is for agriculture. There appears to be, the farm's located in an area where there's a lot of water, a lot of irrigation starting to pop up there. It's a good crop farm. It's just a good row crop farm. When we listed that and word got out that we had that farm listed, we had 5 calls from local farmers around there individually wanting to try to buy the farm before it went to the auction block. A lot of pent up demand. There's no other farms for sale in that area. So that's supply and demand, right?
Right.
This auction is setting itself up to be a very fine auction for these folks. And the reason why I think that is a great case study is it's stereotypical of agricultural land. And the inverse of that is when we see what we call trader properties, and those are properties that were bought in the last 2 or 3 years, and somebody thinks they got a great deal on it. They're putting it back on the market just to try to make a quick buck. Those don't typically always sell well at auction. People are doing their research and they're saying, oh, this was bought just a few, we're in the information age. So data is so accessible, on this tool right here that people just pick it up and say, oh, they bought this a couple of years ago for this price. I'm reeling in my expectations. I'm not near as aggressively trying to buy that. So
interesting.
Tell me the difference between a live auction and I suppose a virtual or online auction. What would prompt you to go one direction over the other, or are they simultaneous?
Well, for an auctioneer, one of them's a lot more fun than the other. I don't know a lot of auctioneers that are my age or that have entered the business, in the last 25 years that really got excited about doing online auctions. But again, things change in industries, and really going back probably 10 to 12 years ago, we started seeing a shift, a strong migratory shift where bidders said, hey, is this going to be online? Or I really like that concept. Notifications on their telephone that they have been outbid, and you're on the tractor as a farmer, or you're shopping in a store and you're trying to buy a home. And this evening, the bidding's going to conclude right at 5 o'clock, and you're in the grocery store at 2 o'clock, and ping, you just got a pop up on your phone says you've been outbid, and you can place another bid right there. That stuff is very valuable to consumers that want, at the end of the day, to purchase property. That's what they're after: homes, commercial property, farm property. Live auctions absolutely still have their place in America. They're still strong, but online auctions and the accessibility of an online auction, and for an auction company, the affordability, it's not that overly expensive to supply that to the clients. The clients like it better. So there's definitely a strong shift taking place over the last 10, 15 years in the auction industry.
Makes me
and
sick.
then if you look at maybe one of the questions that you may have had on the heels of that is, well, are there certain types of properties that yield better towards live auctions than online? Was farm auctions. And when we talked about pent up demand, people that know each other and they farm in these communities, but they can still be good neighbors and aggressively bid on farmland because that is the business that they're in. I've seen a lot of sales where farms bring almost twice what the farm was actually worth in the open market. And when the bidding's over, one farm will go over and shake the other one's hand. It's a horse race, and one horse has to lose. So it doesn't have to be this heated argument or debate. And sometimes there's obviously there's that plays into the equation too, where people do become a little bit upset. We take that into account. This is an interesting thing to talk about, but when you're at a live auction, you may have religious groups like the Amish or some people that don't have phones, they don't have cell phones, they don't have telephones except for maybe a centralized telephone in their community. It is not feasible really for them to bid in an online auction. Now, they have found workarounds. They can have a proxy that bids for them on those, but more often than not, when we're in an Amish community, we'll have a live auction, and that can have its strengths and its weaknesses.
Tailored to the audience.
That's it.
Love it. What's the difference? You've mentioned the words reserve auction a couple of times. What's the difference between absolute and reserve auction?
Absolute is the connotation in the word is it's going to sell absolutely. So regardless of what the bidding is in that event, you're sending a message to the public that this property will be sold at the end of this auction. We're going to put the hammer down, on it at some point. The gavel goes down, sold to Julia for $850,000. Congratulations. But somebody's going to own the property with reserve. So other than, I believe Louisiana is the only one that doesn't fall under this license or this the code, the state law. But the ruling is all auctions from consumer protection, all auctions are deemed to be with the reserve price unless you explicitly change the context of that in your marketing. So if we're having a land auction or estate auction or a home auction, public auction, anything like that, the seller's maintaining the right to accept or reject the high bid. Those are with reserve auctions. You may or may not get something bought that day, depending on how high the bidding goes. If you change the connotation in your marketing and say, this property is selling absolute, or it's an absolute auction, or it's we're selling it with no minimum, no reserve price, you're changing that and telling the consumer that it is selling regardless of price. This property will be sold on auction day. And obviously the reasoning behind that, Brandon, is you're trying to excite more consumers to say there's no messing around on this one. It's whether it brings $1 or $1 million, it's going to have a new owner after the auction.
As a seller operating in that auction environment, are you giving them a pretty good sense of what that asset's going to trade for? Do they have a pretty good sense of that going in?
We do try to do market studies. We try to get our sellers prepared for what maybe like-kind properties and auctioneers, by the way, are very conservative by nature. So if you have a piece of equipment or something that cost $100,000, I'm going to be talking to you about $70,000 or $80,000. I'm not going to talk about retail price in a cash-oriented sale. But yes, you try to reel your sellers in. The challenge is you don't know from auction to auction how strong the market's going to show up. That's the reality. I have not been in my career a big proponent of absolute auctions, but I would not necessarily say that's been a hindrance to me or my clients. We're getting great prices out of our property. I'm having wonderful conversations with people before I take their property to an auction. Okay, so my success rate at auction it's above 95%, and I've maintained that for a lot of years, and people ask me, I have to lead by example in this business. So when they say, what's the secret? And I said, well, just be careful what you take to an auction. You go back to that NAR statistic. Not everything in this country is meant to, or every seller is meant to be sold at a public auction. Right?
Sure.
You've got to be careful about what you take to auction. When you find the motivated client that has reasonable expectations and the need, and they're flexible in that, and you believe that they have something that can drive market demand, it's something that people want to buy, then you've got a good candidate for an auction. But it's okay to step over 10 stones before you get to that.
Yeah.
I have one question, and then we should probably switch to the brokerage side. You spoke about financing. Some buyers come with financing. Are there banks out there that are more specialized or comfortable with financing in an auction setting? I just can't imagine that I go to my bank down the road and that's what they offer or do.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what they're normally doing is they're going to finance you based on you. When you go into farm markets, let's start with the land business. Most land-oriented banks, your Farm Credits, federal land banks, any small community banks or town banks in your hometown that are used to ag lending, they're going to be familiar with the auction method of marketing. Now I'm going to look at Julia and her husband, how much revenue you bring in, what other farms that you own, is there debt on those farms? If this one brings a little bit too much, we may need you to pledge another farm. We're going to mitigate our risk. By collateralizing enough assets. If we have to take that back, we're not going to lose $800,000, right? So
Okay.
in those kind of markets, they're really looking at the individual. I think the same thing more so in residential and commercial, but it becomes much stricter because a lot of these banks that are in larger towns or cities or these major metropolitan areas, we're finding that they're getting bought up by conglomerates. So Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and that problem exists with the person that you're going in the door to talk to locally is not the decision maker on that loan. It's got to go up to Milwaukee, or it's got to go to Dallas, Texas. And that's where the loan, the guidelines and the requirements are set for these loans. So it's much, much tougher, I think, in the residential and in the commercial setting. With this caveat, you can still have a lot of assets in the bank. You can be liquid in a bank, as you folks well know. There's people that are sitting on top of a lot of real estate and a lot of cash. They generally can go in and get some type of a line of credit. They can get some type of financing out there for a specific event. And that is what we just did for the U.S. Bankruptcy Court out here in Douglas County, Kansas. 3 weeks ago, we sold a property. It brought $1.1 million. The requirement is you had to pre-register. You had to bring a bank letter. You had to bring $25,000 cashier's check to qualify to bid. And you had to bring a bank letter that was going to underwrite you up to the amount that you're willing to bid in the auction. We had 60 people in attendance. We had 17 registered bidders. And out of those 17, I believe 10 of them were well over $1 million that they had access to. One guy brought us a letter from a bank and said he's capable of buying the property at any amount that he wants. We'll stand behind him. That's a pretty good bank. Yeah, they said they gave us an open.
Let me tell you what that bank is offline. I'm gonna want.
It's no lie. They gave us an open-ended letter on a guy with no amount in it, and I said, he goes, "Will this work?" And I said, "But for about anything."
Seems like it will.
You don't see that very often in today's age. So, but I will say, while we're on this topic, that post 2007, 2008, during the collapse, the residential and the home markets collapsing, Dodd-Frank and a lot of the regulatory bills that were passed out there have really tightened the lending practices on both the banks and the way that they work with appraisers. That has not made it any easier for people to borrow capital in the residential sector. Even if you're a solid buyer, it makes it a little bit tougher to go out and apply for a home loan today.
So these conversations are all mostly happening prior to the auction. That's the buyer going to their bank, preparing for this set date of, auction XYZ for these 7 properties today.
It absolutely does. We normally have a minimum of 30 days marketing when we advertise a property. In that first week to 10 days, we try to hit the market really, really hard because we want to put everybody on notice that this property is going to be sold offered at least at auction. And what we're really signaling is go get your financing or whatever you need to do in line to participate in this sale. We're giving you plenty of advance notice. That gives them almost 3 weeks to go get prepared and come back to participate in that auction.
Gotcha. Well, auctions are fascinating. I would love to attend one with you, actually. So that I'll reach out and hopefully schedule a few down the road. But let's switch to brokerage. So obviously, United Country is full of brokers and agents. Would you say that professional is an expanding industry, or is it contracting? What's your general take on what's happening with the number of people and the quality coming in and out?
The real estate industry as a whole kind of ebbs and flows. So last year through the first 6 months of the year, the market started shifting, inventory's gotten really tight. We see a lot of times agents that have licenses that are non-productive or non-active agents will leave the business. In June, so that would be the 6th month of the year, NAR, the National Association of Realtors, had reported that they had lost 60,000 agents. So they're losing at a pace nationwide of about 10,000 agents per month. The business was purging out. But that is the culmination of the previous 4 or 5 years when it was really frothy and the markets were fat. You saw your neighbor or sister-in-law or somebody in real estate making pretty good money, pretty good wages. The business looked easy from the outside, so they all rushed out and they got a real estate license. And then found out, oh, this is actually work. I have to get up every day unemployed and I got to go find work. Being an independent contractor is not always an easy way to make a living. So it ebbs and flows. I think that the real estate industry, there is going to be some consolidation. Julia, to answer that question, I think it could shrink a little bit, over the next 5 years, because what I think is going to happen is, again, we're seeing a lot of these larger offices being absorbed by big companies, franchises, or organizations, and we're seeing a lot of consolidation in the industry. So that doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily lose all of the agents and brokers, but I think there may be less parent companies that are underwriting and supporting them. I think the industry itself will shrink. And we're also running into technology that is allowing a lot more access to homeowners, to buyers. They can self-assist in a lot of these. There's, much like we talked about with online auctions changing the live auction industry, there's a little bit of a paradigm shift going on right now in traditional real estate and brokerage real estate also.
I can imagine. Yeah. I guess, what does United Country's outlook look like? So if the industry is shrinking and contracting, are you seeking out and bringing on board certain types of agents and brokers that can be resilient and withstand? Is your training supporting that? What's that kind of look like for you?
Yeah, that's you're right on point. That's exactly what is in our plans. And we're very relevant in non-urban America. There are a tremendous amount of real estate agents and brokers in non-urban America today. I think you see as much or more independent brokerages there as you would in metropolitan areas. I'm going to argue that the vast majority of real estate brokers in Kansas City, for example, are going to be stapled to a franchise brand or a larger organization. When you go to that little town of 600 people that I told you I was from, there's 2 different auctioneers and 2 realtors in that town, and you've never heard of their companies before. They're independent companies that are out there. So you'll see a lot of that across the country. Kind of what's on our forefront is expanding the brand into the non-urban markets. And the way to do that is from the delivery of services, technology, marketing, training. And then for the brokers, it's how, if I do recruiting strategies, how do I attract those agents to come in? And then once I've got them, how do I retain them inside of my brokerage? That's what United Country's gotten very good at over the last 100 years. I can give you the whole lowdown on United Country, but the reality is we intend to stay very relevant in non-urban America in the sale of properties outside of the urban markets.
I love it.
Just to give you a snapshot of United Country. So today we're about 5,000 agents and brokers across the country, around 500 offices. Inside of that 5,000 headcount, there's about 300 professional auctioneers inside of our system. And the one thing that's notable about the company, this is where I try to hide the ego. Auctioneers, they tend to be very proud, individuals. But I will say, here's what I take the most pride in, what we've accomplished in the last 17 years. There is no other franchise model in America that is doing or has done what United Country has accomplished, and that is to successfully and fully integrate auction services into its franchise model. So at the grassroots level, when you buy a franchise and you operate that within United Country, you have from day one auction services available to you. And it's not window dressing. It is a president like me and Trina, you met in here in the home office, and personnel that work in the company every day to support auction services. We like being a forerunner in that, because going back to your question, I think that's a significant hook for us in non-urban America, where auctions tend to lie.
Yeah, you're bringing.
I probably got,
Yeah,
go
go
ahead,
ahead,
Brady.
Julia. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think I have one more question, but what does, for the auctioneer and then for the broker, like what are successful qualities, characteristics that each need to have, for that individual?
I think they're a lot in the same, and it is, there's a point of differentiation that I'll state here in a minute, but the key elements I think that make up a good broker and a good auctioneer at the same time. Keep in mind that the vast majority of auctioneers in this country have a real estate agent or broker's license. If you sell real estate at auction, in most states, you're required to have a real estate license. Not all of them, but in most states. So there's some key attributes that they tend to hold. And one is you have to be motivated. My mentor told me 30 years ago, he said, listen, here's one thing I can tell you about this business. And you're either going to adhere to this or you'll end up doing something else down the road. Is every morning when your feet hit the floor, when you get out of bed, you're unemployed. That's the life of an independent contractor, is you have to go find work. You have to be on pursuit every day. Mm-hmm. So being self-motivated and self-starter, I think you have to have a genuine care and concern for individuals. Mm-hmm. I think there's a certain amount of talent. You have to have a type A personality, especially in the auction business. For many, many years, what's kept most people out of the auction business is if you guys were in a crowded scene right now and you needed somebody to stand up on a chair and start chanting, out there like they're half crazy, just chanting, say, hey, can I get your attention? I'm going to sell you something, and hold it up in the air and just start screaming out numbers that I'm your guy. The vast majority of people standing around you out there in that area, their internal kind of constitution would not allow them to do that. They're not your person, right?
You're the unemployed
I
chair
think have
guy.
a very strong type A personality. Now, here's the caveat where I was split, and this is not to imply that brokers don't have empathy, but there is a nuance in this business. People don't normally get up in the morning just feeling good and think, I think I'll just call the auctioneer and sell all my stuff at auction today. That's not a normal visceral response for most people. Mm-hmm. So brokers a lot of times get calls from sellers that are either serious about selling, wanting information, sampling the market. When an auction company gets a phone call, more often than not, there's an issue. There's some underlying factor that's causing a significant amount of pain in their life, mm-hmm. and they're asking us to solve that pain. People pass away, which is, you have to empathize and sympathize with the people that just lost their parents or their grandparents. There's divorce cases going on. There's financial issues and bankruptcy going on, but it's a variety of things that we deal with in the auction business. And I'll go back to this. If you don't have a genuine concern for folks, for people and what they're going through, and you can't put yourself in their shoes, I'm not going to say you won't stay in the auction business very long, but it's going to be hard to be proficient at it.
That empathy component is pivotal.
That's spot on. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And from our side of the business and any service business that you're in, we have to understand our clients. Shawn, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you shedding some light on this area of the auction, the brokerage business that I certainly didn't know about. And I know our listeners will be intrigued to kind of learn about this. Thank you so much. Where can people find you if they want to learn more, if they want to see some of the auctions that may be going on? Where can they find you?
Yeah, great question. So we We have links to all of our property and a link to the auction website at unitedcountry.com. That's the national website. Lucinda and I own, that's my wife. She owns a brokerage here in Kansas City called Buy Heritage, B-U-Y, like you buy something, buyheritage.com. And yeah, that's we're pretty simple folks to find. If you type Shawn Terrell into the internet, there's a good chance I'm going to pop up. So
me too.
Wonderful.
We'll link some of those in the show notes and have this out to folks. Thank you, Shawn. Thank you again. Julia, thanks for coming on and guest hosting too. Awesome questions. And listeners, thanks for listening. Until next time, we'll see you later.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shawn.
You bet.